Greetings, this is Chapter 8, Gender Discrimination. We're now going to get into this discussion about the notion of gender discrimination. Often you hear it worked interchangeably with sex discrimination. I have used the terminology interchangeably, but it's important for us to understand that it started as sex discrimination, and sex discrimination had to do with your biological sex. But as we have grown and learned more about sex and gender identity and things like that. And now that um, Title VII does protect gender identity in its legislation, we're now moving and trending towards using gender discrimination versus sex discrimination in our language. So there are 8 learning objectives in this chapter. Number 1, we're going to review Title VII and other laws regarding gender discrimination and learn a little bit about some of that history. Understand the background of gender discrimination and how we know it still exists. So basically, we're going to look at the data and to be able to demonstrate that gender discrimination is still a real thing. We're going to recognize many different ways in which gender discrimination is manifested in the workplace. And it's not always in a simple way. It can be in more subtle ways. Just as we were talking about with race discrimination and things like that, sort of unconscious bias and microaggressions that can happen, these same things happen with respect to gender. So gender discrimination is not always a blatant, I will treat women differently than men in the workplace. It may actually be far more complex than that, and addressing subtleties in the way that we are treated and the opportunities that we give people and things like that. Number 4, we're going to analyze a situation and determine if there are gender issues that may result in employer liability. So part of what I want you to be doing in this chapter is really understanding different scenarios and determining if there are gender discrimination issues. Number 5, we're going to define fetal protection policies, gender plus and pregnancy discrimination, and workplace lactation issues, as well as other gender-based logistical concerns. Again, women or women born with a uterus, if we want to be clear about this, because there can be transgender males who also still have a uterus and can still give birth. So it's not always an issue for women specifically, but it can be an issue for someone who was born with female genitalia and what impact that has on them. So we think about workplace lactation issues and other pregnancy discrimination issues, particularly for somebody who may be transgender who is also pregnant. So there's lots of complications I don't know, complications is maybe not the right word, but maybe the better word is nuances and complex issues that really need to be considered. It's not as straightforward as I guess it used to be, that we just assumed it was male versus female, masculine versus feminine, men versus women. It now has a lot more nuance to it. Number 6, differentiate between legal and illegal grooming policies. There are some policies that are completely legal, and there are some that are not. When we're talking about grooming, we're talking about makeup and dress codes and things like that. So there are some that are appropriate that we can require of our employees, and there are some that are inappropriate. We'll get into that. We're going to list common gender realities at odds with common bases for illegal workplace determinations. So what are some of the realities around workplace discrimination issues? And we're going to distinguish between what we mean by equal pay and comparable worth and how these things are nuanced. As I said in the opening slide, that we have moved more towards the concept of gender discrimination versus sex discrimination. And the preface in the textbook actually does a nice job sort of summarizing why this change was made and where we're at in terms of using the term gender discrimination versus sex discrimination at this point. So here's the statutory basis for gender discrimination. And it says, it shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's sex/gender. And that's the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act amended. Um, uh, and also the second terminology is the term because of sex or on the basis of sex includes but is not limited to because of or on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, and women affected by pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions shall be treated the same for all employment related purposes, including receipt of benefits under fringe benefit programs or other persons not so affected but similar to their inability or ability to work. And that's the amendment to the Title VII, which was the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Even though it's really considered a separate act, it was technically an amendment to Title VII. So you can see here, right? Using the term women, assuming only women give birth, really eliminates the notion of a trans man who may still be capable of being pregnant and giving birth. And so therefore the language needs to be more inclusive of gender identity, and things like that. So that's why we tend to use that larger and more inclusive term, gender. Does gender or sex discrimination still exist? Absolutely. The EEOC chair has stated sex discrimination against males and females alike continues to be a problem in the 21st century. We see a gender pay gap. We see that only 6% of the S&P 500 CEOs are women. It's sort of like a bird cage. It's like we put them on a pedestal, we put them in this lovely cage, and we don't allow them to express themselves and to expand their wings and to be the people that they need to be. I mean, I love that imagery of the bird cage, and kind of reminds me a little bit of obviously Maya Angelou's poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And yes, we see most claims of gender discrimination are based on women because they are the protected class. We give special consideration to women, when we are applying discrimination policies. That doesn't mean that men can't experience sex discrimination, which they do. There's no doubt about it. But the majority of the cases are truly filed by women because we see pay differentials and treatment differentials and promotional differentials and all sorts of issues, the assumptions, the microaggressions that happen, the othering that happens for women in the workplace. It's definitely challenging. It really does exist. Here's just an interesting tidbit, Exhibit 8.3. There is a steady growth in female CEOs, but only 20 in the Fortune 500. I mean, this is from 1995 to 2013. Seeing this lack of growth is really phenomenal. I don't know why, but we're starting to see some trends, but it's still pretty bad. The focus of EEOC claims have shifted from hiring discrimination to on-the-job issues. Women are getting hired, but now it's about, are they being put in positions that are not getting promotions? Are they being put in positions where they're not being taken seriously? Are they not getting the proper pay? Are they not allowed to take their pregnancy leave? What if they're breastfeeding moms and they need a lactation room to pump milk? There's all sorts of characteristics and issues here that we have to think about. Women disproportionately take on the responsibility for child rearing, caregiving for elderly parents as well as their children, perhaps even siblings and others in the family. And they are victims of domestic violence. And so these issues really kind of layer into workplace issues because women then become more at risk for domestic violence in the workplace, where their partners can come in and we've seen evidence of this with cases where someone was a victim of domestic violence and their husband came into the workplace and was very violent, trying to reclaim control over the individual who had left them or was a victim of violence. So there's some horrendous cases out there, which we're not even going to get into because it's really not the purpose of this class. But just recognize that domestic violence issues can overlay with these issues in the workplace, and we need to be mindful of that. There are tons of gender stereotypes which really get at more of the microaggressions that women experience in the workplace. And I love the great summary that we have here in Exhibit 8.5 about how women are considered, or whether the stereotypes that are perceived in the workplace. For example, that women are better suited to repetitive fine motor skills. I have horrible eye-hand coordination. I'm not sure that I would be good at that. But maybe there are others that are. And but I think there are men that also have, good fine motor scales. But these are very stereotypical, and it's because that they were able to then say, well, women can do this. They can do jobs that are not creative, but they're simply, completing tasks, and that's it. Another one, women are too unstable to handle jobs with responsibility and pressure. And again, this is the assumption that women were not capable of handling difficult conversations and difficult concepts. And that's, of course, not true. That men make better employees because they're more aggressive. Well, why does aggression mean that they're better? Right? Maybe they are more aggressive. Maybe they're not. Not all men are aggressive. Some men are. There's all issues of toxic masculinity and things like that we could talk about. But it's a horrible stereotype that men, A, are more aggressive, and B, that they would make a better employee because they're more aggressive. That men would not do well at jobs that are nurturing, such as daycare or nursing or elder care and the like. But we see tremendous growth in men engaged in daycare and nursing profession. I have friends who have recently gone back to school to get nursing degrees, and as men have really flocked to those areas. They can be caring, they can be nurturing. When women marry, they will get pregnant and leave their jobs. Well, that's not necessarily true. Many women would want to stay on their jobs after they're pregnant, and they're far more likely to want to do that if there's a company that has flexible policies that enable them to juggle their work family challenges, right? And not all women want to get pregnant. I've known plenty of people who have had tremendous pressure on them to get pregnant once they got married, but they said they had no desire to have children. So why would they be treated differently because just because they're a woman? Women are criticized at work. When the belief is that women are criticized when they're criticized at work, they become angry or cry, that they are too emotional, and again, it's not a fun stereotype. A married woman's income is only extra fair family income. It's what they used to euphemistically call pin money. Oh, it's just like, extra money I would have on the side, for my own fun activities or things like that. And that the reality is that a married woman's income is equally as important as their partner's income, and that they many times families depend on the woman's income over the men's income. There's this presumption that men are the breadwinners and women just make the extra money, and that's not the case in all circumstances. And I know plenty of families where it's the woman who's the primary breadwinner and the husband is more the caregiver at home and the supplemental income provider, et cetera, et cetera. And I've known plenty of circumstances where both incomes are equally as important and equally needed, in the management of a family. A woman who changes job as being disloyal or unstable. Well, they don't really investigate why women are changing the jobs. If they're not being treated fairly, if they're not being given opportunities, they're going to look for a place where they're going to have better pay, better opportunities, better treatment. So, it's a chicken egg thing here, right? Sure, women change jobs, but why are they changing jobs? It's not because they're disloyal or that they're unstable, but maybe they're being treated poorly. Women cannot have a job that requires her to have lunch or dinner meetings with men. Again, these are sex-based situations where they assume that a woman would not be allowed to have dinner with a person that is not their husband or their boyfriend or their father. It's a very patriarchal point of view that men could not be controlled if women were to have lunch with them, that they would then be harassed. So they blame the woman as opposed to blaming the harasser in the first place. Or that women cannot have jobs that require a great deal of time to take them away from the home. And again, how do we address this, right? You ask. The job requires you to travel 2 weeks a year, 2 weeks a month. Can you do this job? Yes, I can. Okay, then that's all that matters. I'm not responsible as an employer for how they handle their child care issues, assuming that they have children at home in the first place. It's not our job to figure that out. That's their job to figure it out. So that you can say, yes, I can travel, I can work within these boundaries, and you know, this is what I can, and this is what I can do. That's not an issue. So these are just some examples. You know that there are so many more, but these are great examples of the subtle sex-based, gender-based stereotypes that really have a tremendous impact on both men and women who are struggling, right, to overcome the stereotypes attached to what their identity is, their gender identity